get an hour or two of sleep before you showed up there this morning. We have got plenty of coffee there in the back, and I would like to thank Latham Watkins, LLP, for sponsoring the breakfast this morning, and Hogan Lovells will sponsor the coffee breaks, and we might need a little more coffee as we get going, but we've got a really interesting morning's planned for everybody. I'd also like to thank RCR Wireless for providing the live stream this morning, and obviously we want to thank all those who are joining us on the live stream this morning. It's a great way to get our message and our information out to a larger crowd. So we have an extraordinary lineup, in my opinion, of speakers, and I'd like to add that in addition to the great program, we have a spectacular finish. We're going to give $1,000 away, two $500 winners at the end of the session. You have to be present to win, and I've been told that it's higher percentages than the slot machine down there. So, you know, it's worth a shot at least. So stick around. You'll have evaluation forms. Please fill the evaluation forms out as you go along, and we'll have a little table here in the back, and you can go back there and you'll get a raffle ticket when you fill your evaluation forms. The evaluation forms really are important, and we read them all, and our events committee uses them to help plan for the next year. So please help us out in that regard. We also will be awarding some cash prizes for the use of our app, and so those people that the top 3 users of the app will also get a little cash to put in their pocket, and so keep checking in. Last year, I remember we had a sort of a fierce battle of people running for the top 2 slots in the last hour, so it's quite interesting. Now, let me start off the day with the real reason why you're here. We are very pleased to have join us Dr. Vish Nandlall from Ericsson, who is the company's Chief Technology Officer, and also serves to head the strategy marketing for Ericsson for all of North America. Vish is responsible for identifying Ericsson's long-term vision, defining an overall company strategy, and driving business value creation for Ericsson's customers in North America. Ericsson is also one of our pinnacle sponsors, and Craig Stein serves on our board, so we want to thank them for their continued support. And ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Vish Nandlall.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm glad to see so many freshly scrubbed faces here early in the morning at CCA. Today we're going to talk about the rise of the network, and let me kind of take you a bit on the journey of where this set of thoughts and reflections came from. I started off the year with a little less jump in my step, and I was trying to figure out why that was. I've been in telecom for about 25 years, and there just seems to be this massive crush of uncertainty in our markets. What's going to happen in telecom? Why is it happening? What are we supposed to do? And I'm trying to analyze this. And so I came up with these thoughts. I think in the US in telecom, you live in 2 worlds, right? The mobile industry is growing dramatically. This is the great part of the world, right? So if you look at the trending from the past several quarters, we've been making as an industry about $20 billion a year. We're on track to make $90 billion this year. Fantastic estimates in terms of the success of the telecom industry. And just last year, we passed the trillion megabyte mark in terms of data, 1.4 trillion megabytes in 2012. That was about a 69% increase over the year prior. Great statistics, right? But you also feel that the apocalypse is coming. This is the second world that we live in telecom. Not a great world to be in. This is where it gets a bit shaky. And I think this is where the uncertainty comes from. Because if you look at what happened in 2Q 2013, we only added about 139K subscribers, net adds. This is the lowest number of net adds in the history of US telecoms, apart from maybe the early days of ramp. And you see these over-the-top players like WhatsApp. If you take a look at the trailing 12 months period, WhatsApp had more total messages going through their network than the US and China combined. So things aren't going well, right? But I think after having rationalized this, in general, my sentiment is that telecom is still booming. Right? That might sound like a controversial statement. Telecom is still booming. Even voice. Voice is not in decline. Voice is booming. I think it's really our way of thinking about the industry that's in decline. Right? Let me give you an example. Voice. Voice is something I think that has long been kind of the pariah the past several years as we've seen the decline in voice ARPU and revenues. But if you take a look at what's happening in the universe of communications, people aren't talking less. People are still talking. Right? And what's happened is that the asserting position has really been with over-the-top players. And what have they done? They've really unleashed voice from telephony. They've taken a look at how do you take voice into new modes of communication? How do I take it into new use cases? For us, it's a very rigid construct within the telecom industry. It's a dial, talk, hang-up cycle, right? It's structured so that it's very intrusive. It's not permission-based. The etiquette is very intrusive, right? The termination is based on your numbering plan. What has some of these over-the-top players done? They've taken a look at all the different sessions of component voice service, and they said, let's innovate at every different level of those sessions. Right? And that's what they've done. They've taken a look at how do I use web voice, right? How do I integrate that? And they've come up with WebRTC. How do I take that so I can embed it in a browser experience and make that accessible to the thousands and millions, rather, of web clients that exist out there? They've said, how do I make it permission-based? Right? How do I make it so that it's not so intrusive when I call? Right? How do I take a look at every component of the voice session and innovate it? And that's what they've done. They've rethought voice. Right? It's not that voice is in decline for them. They've just rethought how voice needs to work. So the reason why they've done that is really because I think the basis of competition is starting to shift. Right? The old paradigm of how telecom worked and ruled was on some undifferentiated vanilla services, voice, messaging, and data access. Right? And I think as we look forward, we're going to see that there's a shift now from just scale and robustness of a few undifferentiated services where everything was vertically integrated and we started to decouple some of the parts, but fundamentally still delivering the same services, to choice and flexibility. And this should be pretty apparent to most of you out there if you take a look at what's happening with the apps ecosystems and others. It's been, I want a marketplace of services. I don't just want a few services that are really entrenched in a very rigid construct in terms of how communication works. It's much more of a 19th century model than a 20th century model. So when you really kind of embrace this notion of how really the scale and robustness shift to choice and flexibility is working, you see that it's really starting to play to some of the over-the-top players, people like Google or the Four Horsemen. And in fact, some of these players are stopping the over-the-top attack and actually going under the floor. And if you take a look at what Google's doing now with Google Wireless and Google Fiber, they're starting to experiment on the access side, really trying to understand how do they make the network be really a driver for the delivery of their services. So how do we compete? Right? To compete, I think telecom core network has to become service marketplaces. And I mean this in an interesting sense. Whenever I get my bill from my telco provider, even though I'm part of the industry, I still feel just a surge of anger when I see that number. And I always ask myself, why is that? Why do I feel angry at getting particular voice plan or data access plan bill versus the experience where I go to Whole Foods and I'm paying astronomical prices for the heirloom tomatoes that I'm getting or the Wagyu beef that I'm getting? Why do I feel that way? Why do I feel differently in a marketplace where I actually feel happy to hand over my dollars versus getting some type of subscription service for voice where I feel somewhat aghast, right? So why is it that this experience should be so different than what I have from a telecom perspective? And it's really this shift. It's this choice and flexibility. It's the fact that there's a marketplace of capability that are being offered to the individual users. And this is the marketing side of it, when we get to the technology side of it. Right? I think what we need to do is rethink how the network is built and used. Right? So when we talk about how do we fundamentally rethink our industry so that we don't see it in decline, but that we actually see it as a booming industry, we have to start taking a look at how we deliver services and applications. And if you take a look at what are some of the pillars of how we're rethinking about our network, heterogeneous networks is clearly one of the big trends that's happening on the very edge so that I can get the app coverage that I need. We're moving away from engineering our networks for 8 kilobits per second on the cell edge to something that's substantially different. I need to just have a really good app experience. So how do we do that? I need to be able to provide the type of coverage and capacity for these applications over a data plane, right? Fourth generation IP cloud service provider SDN, I'm going to talk about this part in a minute, because I think this is a unifying component that's threading across all the transformations that you're seeing in the network. And there's very valid reasons for that. And at the same time, we've got really a wholesale, I think, reimplementation of OSS and BSS as well as data analytics. And the idea there is to make these systems much more agile, right? Move away from the risk-washed types of environment that we have in telecom and approach much more of agile, I want to do things faster, quicker type cycle. And I'll talk about this in a minute. Okay, great. So, Mark Andreessen published several years ago this manifesto about how software is eating the world. And if we take a look at some of these technologies, I'd submit that software is actually also eating the network. And certainly if software is eating the world, it's eating the world at a table set by the network. So here's kind of the traditional view of what some of these software abstractions are. And I'm just going to give you a very high-level description of what I think is happening. What I think we see happening is that we're connecting software abstractions to the network. This is actually a pretty unique convergent event. And I'm going to double click on that in a minute because I think it's something that you need to put your shoulders behind to really understand what's happening. What we're doing is we're trying to get away from individually programming our network elements. We want to abstract those into a set of network services that are very easily used and manipulated by the end user. Right? If you think about how we provision new services today, we provision them through a very complicated process. Right? We have to re-architect our network. It'd be much easier if I can program my network. And as a network architect, having lived in the industry for, like I said, many, many years, the way we typically would develop some type of new service is that I'd invent a new protocol. Right? That's the traditional tact. If I want to do PBT, if I want to do VPLS, if I want to do MPLS, I invent new protocols. That's what I do. I invent new protocols. And if you take a look at our industry relative to other industries, the way they do it is they do it through software. They don't do it by putting in new programs. They create robust software abstractions, right, that can be used as fundamental building blocks to create new services. And so this transformation that we're seeing, both in the back office with the cloud being developed and also with the network on SDN, is all about creating software abstractions for the network so that you can actually take the network out of the hands of about 250,000 developers globally who actually understand how to make this stuff happen and put it in the hands of a bunch of IT developers that number around 5 million. And so it's that scale shift that's actually really important. How do I open the network, make it a marketplace for these developers to create new services, right? I'm going to say that again. How do you open the network as a marketplace so you can allow new developers to create new services? And the economies of scale here are really important. This is the math. This is, what's the economic basis for this? It's the math. Take a look at the math. Today, I might serve about, let's say, 1 billion web-connected users by about 250,000 developers, right? That's how it's mediated. In the future, it's probably going to be 5 billion device-connected users that need to be mediated by about 5 million developers, right? And that's an order shift from a value of 20 per developer to a value of 50. And those developers, in terms of that scale, are the things that are going to create the economy for how the network is going to be used and built. So this is important. Creating software abstractions unleashes the network to this new set of developers that can create massive outsized network effects that can actually fulfill the vision of what Ericsson calls a network society, which is really this whole view of 50 billion connected users, that there's going to be an Internet of Things. So we need to unleash the network, make it a marketplace, allow developers to come in and use it. And we need to do that by really creating an intersection between this very robust network that is held privately in the hands of a few priests who understand how to do traffic management and IP networking, and put it in the hands of the IT developers. It's a scary thought, but this is what we need to do. So how is this working? I think, when we first talk about cloud and SDN and all these other technologies, I think the general consensus is that that's probably sometime in the future. It's going to happen a long time from now. And the reason why I'm reluctant and why there's friction in terms of the adoption of these capabilities is that it's very difficult to even frame sometimes what the value proposition is. Right? We still haven't hit critical mass in terms of what is the value of going to cloud, what is the value of going to SDN, because it's still not there. It just seems to be lurking in the background. And we as a community haven't really established the metrics to really objectively evaluate what we're bringing to the table with these technologies. And I think that there's several things that we need to think of. And this is just to show you what the adoption rate looked like from the Verizon Terramark service. So over the course of January 2012 to June 2013, they had a 100% increase in memory use, 90% increase in storage, a 35% increase in virtual machines, right? And the reason why there's an asymmetric relationship between the number of virtual machines and the data services is simply that the applications that are going in their data center are becoming more complex. Becoming more complex. But traditionally, what's in a data center? What's in a cloud environment? It's web applications. It's internet-facing applications. It's lightweight R&D. It's test dev. It's stuff that potentially isn't really harnessing the value of what a cloud can give. And what they've seen is that more sophisticated applications are being brought in because the literacy about what the value proposition of a cloud environment from a back office perspective is getting better. They're actually putting ERP applications in the cloud. Right? And that's because the first principle of what cloud can deliver as a business proposition is that it delivers cost advantage. It lowers the cost base of delivering services. This is really important because when you get into an environment where you're moving from choice and flexibility and you're not just monetizing 2 or 3 different services, you're monetizing hundreds of different services, the cost basis of developing those services had better be really, really low, especially if the ARPU is less than $1 per service. When you think about this whole digital revolution and digital services, you have to think about how do I take my network, make it a marketplace, open it up for choice and flexibility, and make it so that the cost base of delivering those services is proportional to the ARPU, right? I don't want a $1 ARPU service and have to pay 90% of capital and OpEx costs behind it. That's probably not a profitable regime. You need to take a look at that first value proposition, its cost. Second value proposition actually leaps off the screen from this. Second value proposition is that data services is this thing that's actually really important, right? And I'll talk about that in a minute. So we're fundamentally changing the cost basis for delivering services. And if you take a look at, for instance, an M1 instance off of Amazon, you look at what the monthly tab is for something like that. It's around $175. It's pretty low in terms of the economies of scale that an SMB can get from a cloud versus implementing it on their own. Right? So I'll give you a couple of good statistics for this, just to kind of charge up your thought process on the cost basis. So in an average enterprise environment, if you have a number of servers and you have a number of applications, you have a number of sysadmins to manage that. And there's this ratio that we use in the industry, which is how many sysadmins per server, right? Those are the types of ratios that you want to look at. So typically the ratio is 1 sysadmin to 50 servers. So in a cloud environment, with the amount of automation that I can bring in, the ratio leaps astronomically. You can have 1 sysadmin for 5,000 servers. So the OpEx cost in the cloud is much lower. The agility in the cloud is also much higher. So my ability to kind of provision very quickly is very high in the cloud versus using risk-laden IT systems that exist in our networks today. So it's really the cost basis and the agility. And the agility is actually bound to the fact that I have these very flexible data services, right? And that's what I talked about in the prior slide. You look at the storage services. Flexible data services really starts to provide a tremendous amount of agility, right? And that agility and that cost base allows you to compete in terms of the shift from scale and robustness to choice and flexibility, right? Now, the big thing that I think is really important in this transformation is the fact that you can start to experiment with different business models. And this is really important because when things are uncertain, you need to start to experiment a little bit more. And I know this is the anathema for a lot of people because everyone likes to have something very predictable, right? And I think we're shifting as an industry. And this is where the uncertainty comes from. This is where that queasiness in the pit of your stomach comes from when you think about the telecom industry, because you actually don't know what that business model is going to be, right? And so experimentation is really, really important. This isn't like I moved from 2G to 3G, right? I have prior experience in moving from different generations of radio access technology, so I can be very predictive about what the future is going to be and how do I plan and allocate resources. This is not about execution risk, it's about market uncertainty. And so when you're living in a world of market uncertainty, you really do need different mechanisms to be able to speed through the types of experimentation cycles and fail fast, right? This is the whole Eric Ries's lean methodology, right? I want to take an idea, I want to be able to code it really quickly using the software abstractions that I have in my network, create new, valuable, unique, differentiated services for my end user, and then learn to see how do I adapt that service so that I can actually translate it into something that can scale and give me revenue. Right? You want to be able to do this quickly. In an era where it takes 18-month cycles to be able to do that, that's not something that's consistent with uncertainty in the market. Right? You need to have a different methodology to be able to scale and experiment. This is what Google does really well. This is what Amazon does really well. Because they have flexibility and the lower cost base, they can run many, many different experiments and find out what the business models are that will actually give them traction in terms of gaining revenue. So this is an important capability. So when you think about what's happening, I think you really need to embrace a transformation that's happening. Cloud, SDN, NFV, you'll hear these words. I think what you really need to take away with it is that we're converging data, compute, and network with software. That's what's happening, right? And we as an industry don't do much, right? We have very few assets in our toolkit, right? We have data services, right? We store things, we compute on things, and we move things, right? So I store things, I store data, I compute on things, I compute on data, and I move data around through the network. That's what we do. And profit pools shift when we converge parts of this, right? Do you remember when I put data and compute together? That was something that the industry called Hadoop or MapReduce. This is what Google's doing. This is where they do massive data analytics. That's what came out of data and compute being put together. When network and compute was put together, we had the internet, right? When data and network put together, we had storage area networks. We had network attack storage. All these different convergent events created massive shifts in the profit pools of our industry. And now what's happening is all these pieces are being pulled together, bolted on through a software abstraction layer. And this is probably the ultimate convergence event in our industry. So unleashing these services through software makes the network a first-class citizen to IT developers. Now, you know, you've probably heard this because I've been in the industry for a while as well, and I always hear about this long tail of developers and blah, blah, blah. Everything's going to be really cool if, you know, I can get some guy to develop an application on top of my MPLS network. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about making these networks available to IT developers, available to people who, if you want to provision a VPN service, it doesn't take 90 days. It takes an hour. If you want to be able to understand how the new video service from Netflix is operating over your network, I can rapidly provision an experience for that end user versus having to harden it through months and months and months of IT development. This is where the real value of the network comes in, where I unleash network services from the network. I don't make it complicated, make it very easy to deploy. So if you can make these new IT developers, and you can make it expressive in a language that they can understand so that it's not locked in the hands of maybe 250,000 developers, but it's in the hands of 5 million developers. Well, that is an accomplishment. And this, by the way, is why when you take a look at Open Daylight, OpenStack, all these new consortia that are coming around, which are open source, that are actually framing the value proposition for SDN and for cloud, the reason why they're open is because they're trying to create developer communities. That's why they're doing it. The guy who has the biggest developer community on their platform is the guy who wins at the end of the day. And that's why if something's proprietary, ultimately that's going to crater and die, right? So it needs to be open. You're trying to create a developer community. The power of these platforms is in the accessibility of those platforms to third-party developers, IT developers. And numbers mean something in this game. Scale matters, right? If you have 250,000, you're probably only reaching a few people. If you have 5 million, you're reaching a lot of people. You're playing in the scale and flexibility game. I think these technologies have the ability to reset the profit pools in our industry. This is something to put your shoulder behind. I think this is transformative. I think it's really happening. I think we're starting to get the value propositions. I think those value propositions are translating into some early wins right now, and that it's starting to take momentum, starting to take scale. And I think the transformation's happening now. So this is my message to you. It's happening now. And it only looks slow if you're losing. Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vish. Wow, that's pretty interesting stuff there for me. Forming these strategic partnerships, realize it's an important part of being competitive, and just gave us a lot to chew on there, so thank you so very much. Next, we'll be hearing from our CEO Roundtable. This morning we are pleased to have with us a group of very talented